A mother's life was shattered the day her 2-year-old daughter disappeared from their family farm, vanishing without a trace after being left to play near the cornfield for just a few minutes. For years, the farming family mourned, never knowing what had happened, while the mother struggled to forgive herself for leaving her daughter unattended. Every investigation led nowhere, leaving them with nothing but heartache and unanswered questions. Yet, 10 years later, by pure coincidence, she entered a neighbor's pig barn, and there she found a small clue, a clue that would eventually lead her to uncover the shocking and unbelievable truth behind her daughter's disappearance. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great stories like this one. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for our next video, and check out others you might have missed. See you next time. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us set the scene. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling Nebraska farmland, casting long shadows across the weathered barn and the endless rows of corn stretching to the horizon. Laura Monroe, now 50 years old, wiped the sweat from her brow as she made her way towards the farmhouse. The years had etched deep lines into her face, each one a testament to the hardships she had endured. As she reached the mudroom, Laura began the familiar ritual of removing her dirt-caked boots. The cool air inside was a welcome respite from the sweltering heat outside. Bent down, intending to place her boots on the lowest shelf, a space she had always kept clear for quick storage, her hands froze midair when she noticed, tucked away in a corner partially hidden by shadows, a pair of small cowboy boots. Her breath caught in her throat as a wave of memories crashed over her. Those weren't just any boots. They belonged to her daughter, Sophia, who had vanished without a trace 10 years ago. With trembling fingers, Laura reached out, gently brushing against the worn leather. In that instant, she was transported back in time. She could almost see little Sophia standing before her, a vibrant 2-year-old with fiery red hair and a smile that could light up the darkest room. Sophia had loved those boots, insisting on wearing them everywhere, even to bed, if Laura had let her. The vision was so vivid and real that for a moment, Laura forgot to breathe. Sophia had been the light of their lives, bringing joy and laughter to the farm, which now seemed cold and purposeless. Every day since her disappearance had been a struggle, each moment filled with grief and haunting memories. Laura's mind wandered back to that fateful day, replaying the scene that had tormented her for a decade. She had left Sophia to play near the cornfield, thinking she'd be safe for just a few minutes. But when Laura returned, the little girl was gone. They had searched frantically, convinced that she had simply gotten lost in the tall corn. Yet as hours turned into days and days into weeks, the horrible truth began to sink in. Sophia wasn't just lost. She was gone. With a heavy heart, Laura picked up the tiny boots, unable to bear leaving them behind as a constant reminder of her greatest failure. Determined to keep them from catching her off guard again, she decided to take them to the attic, even though every unexpected sighting would bring fresh pain. Making her way through the house, boots in hand, Laura passed the living room where her husband, Daniel, was preparing their lunch. He glanced up with a question forming on his lips, but it died as soon as he saw what she was carrying. An unspoken understanding passed between them, silent yet profound, because they both knew the weight of what those little boots represented. Climbing the creaky stairs to the attic, the musty air and dim light added to the somber mood as she found a quiet corner to place the boots. Holding them close to her chest, she whispered a promise into the stillness. "Sophia, my sweet girl, I know you're out there somewhere. Mom and Dad will never stop looking for you. We'll find you, I promise." With trembling hands, she gently placed the boots down and turned away, unable to look at them any longer. As she descended the stairs, Laura tried to steel herself for the rest of the day, knowing that the ghost of her missing daughter would haunt her every step. Returning to the living room, Daniel was waiting at the table. The smell of freshly prepared food filled the air, but neither felt much like eating. Sliding into her chair and meeting Daniel's eyes across the table, the years of shared grief had created a silent language between them. With quiet remorse, Laura softly said, "I'm sorry, Daniel. gesturing at the spread before them. You went to all this trouble, but I just don't have an appetite anymore. Maybe we can save it for dinner. Daniel nodded, understanding all too well, and pushed his own plate away, the food barely touched. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their loss hanging heavy in the air between them. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat with hesitation as he broached the subject they both dreaded and clung to in equal measure. Have you heard anything new from the investigators? Any new clues about Sophia? The question made Laura's heart constrict. She remembered how many times they had asked each other this over the years, how many times hope had flared only to be extinguished by yet another dead end. Slowly shaking her head, her voice barely above a whisper, she replied, "No, nothing new. I called the police department yesterday, but it's the same old story. No leads, no updates, no clues." She paused, the words bitter on her tongue. They're not even updating us as frequently anymore. I think they might be giving up. Tears welled in her eyes as she blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back. Do you think we'll ever find her, Daniel? Is she really out there somewhere? Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand in his grip firm and reassuring even as unshed tears glistened in his eyes. We'll find her, Laura, he promised softly. She's out there somewhere, and we won't stop looking. Not ever. They sat in silence for a few more moments, neither touching the food, until Daniel finally stood up and began clearing the plates. Maybe we should cut our break short, he suggested. There's still plenty of work to be done, and it might help you keep busy. Nodding in agreement, Laura rose from her chair, replying, You're right. What did you have in mind? Daniel mentioned, I need to clean out the barn. Although she wished she could help, Laura explained, I've got to deliver those hay bales to the neighboring farms. They've been waiting since morning, and I don't want to keep them any longer. Daniel nodded understandingly, and together they moved towards the door, each preparing to lose themselves in the familiar routines of farm work, hoping to find some respite from the grief that never truly left them. As they stepped out into the harsh sunlight, Laura couldn't help but cast one last glance back at the house. Somewhere in that attic, a pair of tiny cowboy boots sat in silent testimony to their enduring hope and unending sorrow. Outside, the old pickup truck rumbled down the dusty country road, its bed laden with hay bales. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white with tension, Laura had already made several deliveries, each one a welcome distraction for the tumultuous emotions stirred up by finding Sophia's boots. Approaching her final destination, the Riverside family farm, Laura felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She hoped against hope that Mr. Vincent Blackwood wouldn't be there to receive the delivery. Perhaps one of his farm hands would handle it instead. The bad blood between their families ran deep, a conflict that had begun years ago when Laura's parents still ran the farm. Despite the animosity, the Blackwoods still ordered hay from the local landriers, and Laura and Daniel had never been stubborn enough to refuse the business. Deep down, Laura harbored a faint hope that one day they might be able to mend fences and put the old quarrel to rest. As the truck crested a small hill and the Riverside farmhouse came into view, Laura's heart sank when she spotted a figure standing in the yard. Unmistakably Mr. Vincent Blackwood. Taking a deep breath to steel herself for the uncomfortable interaction ahead, she pulled up to the barn, cut the engine, and climbed out of the truck. Mr. Blackwood stood there, his face set in a scowl that seemed permanently etched into his features. "Hello, Vincent," Laura said in a polite tone, though she knew his response would be curt. Indeed, his reply was little more than a grunt. "Hello," as they worked in intense silence to unload the hay bales and stack them in the barn. The air between them was thick with unspoken hostility, making the simple task feel like an eternity. When they finished, Laura wiped the sweat from her brow and turned to him. "I'll send the invoice over later today," she said. Vincent merely nodded, already turning away without so much as a word of thanks. A mixture of frustration and sadness washed over her. She knew he resented having to rely on their hay, and his stubborn refusal to even attempt civility grated on her nerves. As she walked back to her truck, a small sense of satisfaction stirred within her. Despite everything, The Blackwoods still needed them, and that was something to hold on to amid their continued hostility. Just as Laura approached her truck, a sudden commotion caught her attention. A small pink blur darted past her, accompanied by a chorus of startled squeals. Instinctively, she turned to see a young pig racing across the farmyard, clearly having escaped from its pen without a second thought. Years of farm life had honed her reflexes, and she quickly sprang into action, giving chase to the runaway animal. Although the pig was small, it was surprisingly quick, leading Laura on a brief but energetic pursuit around the barn. After several moments of zigzagging, the little pig began to tire. It slowed just enough for Laura to catch up and scoop it into her arms. The animal squirmed briefly before settling, seemingly resigned to its capture. Standing slightly out of breath and holding the pig while looking around, Laura called out, "Vincent, anyone?" but received no response. The farm was eerily quiet, with no sign of Vincent or any of his workers. A frown creased her forehead. It wasn't like Vincent to be so careless with his livestock. She had always known him to be a meticulous farmer. Despite their personal differences, the idea of an animal escaping without anyone noticing struck her as odd. Still holding the pig, Laura began to walk toward where she believed the pig enclosures might be. Over the years, she had gained a general understanding of the layout of Riverside Farm, though she had never had reason to explore it thoroughly. As she approached a large, barn-like structure, the sound of grunting and snuffling confirmed that she was in the right place. The strong, musky odor of pigs grew stronger as she neared the entrance. With her free hand, she pushed open the heavy door, its hinges creaking loudly in the stillness inside. The air was thick and warm, filled with the sounds and smells of dozens of pigs. Squinting to allow her eyes to adjust to the dimmer light within the barn, she saw row upon row of pens stretching out before her, each containing several pigs of various sizes. Laura walked slowly down the central aisle, looking for an empty pen or one that seemed to be missing an occupant. Near the back of the barn, something caught her eye. Partially buried in the dirt in front of one of the pens lay a small pink object. Kneeling down, still clutching the pig, she brushed away some of the dirt with her free hand, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what it was, a Hello Kitty headband, the kind a little girl might wear. Her mind raced. What was a child's headband doing in a pig barn? She knew Vincent had no children. He had always been a confirmed bachelor, and they certainly never had visitors with young children, at least not that she had ever seen. As she stood there, confusion and an inexplicable sense of unease washed over her. Suddenly, a gruff voice shattered the quiet. "What the hell are you doing here? Get out!" Laura spun around to see Vincent standing in the doorway, his face contorted with anger. Caught off guard by his sudden appearance and hostile tone, she fumbled for words. "One of your pigs got out," she managed to stammer, gesturing with the animal still in her arms. "I was just trying to bring it back." But Vincent cut her off, his voice rising. "I don't care what you think you're doing. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." Taken aback by the intensity of his reaction, Laura realized that although they had never been on good terms, this level of anger was extreme, even for Vincent. Something about his demeanor, the wild look in his eyes, sent a chill down her spine. Wordlessly, she set the pig down in the nearest pen and began to back away toward the door. Vincent watched her every move, his body tense, fists clenched at his sides as she passed him. Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The headband, Vincent's overreaction, the escaped pig, none of it added up. With Vincent glaring at her, practically vibrating with barely contained rage, she knew this was not the time to ask questions. Vincent followed her all the way back to her truck, watching as she climbed in and started the engine. As Laura pulled away, she glanced at her rearview mirror to see Vincent still standing there, watching her leave. The encounter left her shaken, her mind whirling with questions and a growing sense of unease as her truck rumbled down the dusty road away from Riverside Farm. Her thoughts were in turmoil. The strange encounter with Vincent, the mysterious headband, and the overall sense of wrongness she had felt in the barn swirled in her mind, refusing to settle. Almost at the edge of the property, A sudden, powerful impulse gripped her. Instead of continuing on her way home, Laura pulled over to the side of the road. Her hands trembled slightly as she put the truck in park and cut the engine. For a long moment, she sat there, staring back at the distant silhouette of the riverside farmhouse. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the fields and bathing everything in a warm, golden light that belied the unease churning in her gut. "This is crazy," she muttered to herself, even as she opened the truck door and stepped out. Yet she could not shake the feeling that if she left now, she'd be making a terrible mistake. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Laura began walking back toward the farm. She didn't have an exact plan, but she knew she needed answers. The decades-long feud between their families now seemed trivial in the face of what she had just experienced. As she approached the farmhouse, she saw Vincent emerge from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He froze when he spotted her, his face darkening with anger once more. "I thought I told you to leave," he growled as she drew near. Laura held up her hands in a placating gesture and said, "I know, Vincent, and I'm sorry for intruding earlier, but I think it's time we talked about this thing between our families." Vincent's scowl deepened as he replied, "There's nothing to talk about. Go home." But Laura stood her ground. "Look, I know you don't like us. I know there's bad blood, but we've been neighbors for decades. We do business together. Don't you think it's time we try to sort this out? If not to become friends, then at least to be civil, even for a moment?" For an instant, something flickered in Vincent's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps a hint of deeper emotion, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by his usual mask of hostility. "It's fine how it is," he said flatly. "I don't need new friends now. If you'll excuse me, I have work to do." And he turned to walk away. Frustration rose within Laura. She had extended an olive branch, and Vincent had almost slapped it away. But then, as he was about to disappear back into the barn, a thought struck her. "Hey, Vincent," she called out. He paused and looked back at her with obvious irritation. "I didn't know you had a child, a girl, right?" "Congratulations," she blurted out. The effect was immediate and startling. Vincent seemed to freeze in place, his face draining of color before flushing a deep, angry red. For a moment, it looked as though he might explode with rage. But then, with visible effort, Vincent composed himself. His voice, when he spoke, was tightly controlled. "I don't have a child. Now, please, leave my property." Laura stood there, stunned into silence. If Vincent didn't have a child, then whose headband was that in the barn? Why had he reacted so strongly to her assumption? As Vincent disappeared into the barn, slamming the door behind him, Laura slowly made her way back to her truck, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Vincent's reaction had been far too extreme for a simple misunderstanding. There was something he was hiding, something that had to do with a child, a girl. Climbing back into her truck and starting the engine, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something far more sinister than she had initially thought. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but one thing was certain. She could not let this go. Whatever secret Vincent was keeping, she was determined to uncover it. With one last glance at Riverside Farm in her rearview mirror, her heart pounded and her palms grew sweaty on the steering wheel. Unsure of her next move, she knew she couldn't face this alone. It was time to talk to Daniel. Together, perhaps they could make sense of this unsettling puzzle and, just maybe, find the answers they had been seeking for so long. The truck's tires crunched on the gravel as Laura drove away from Riverside Farm, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and growing suspicion. Every detail of the encounter with Vincent replayed in her head, each detail growing more significant with every passing moment as she navigated the familiar country roads. Her thoughts drifted back to the pink Hello Kitty headband she had found in the pig barn, a completely incongruous item in that setting, and to Vincent's explosive reaction when she mentioned a child. Suddenly, a thought struck her with such force that she instinctively slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a jarring halt in the middle of the deserted road. Her heart began to race as a long-buried memory surfaced. "Headband," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling in her mind's eye. In that instant, she saw Sophia, her precious little girl, wearing a white headband. Sophia didn't have the same pink Hello Kitty headband. It was a white one, a gift from her grandmother, which she had loved and worn almost every day before she disappeared. How could Laura have forgotten such a detail? Shaking her head in an effort to clear her thoughts, she murmured, "No, it can't be. It's too far-fetched, too coincidental." She had been so focused on moving forward with her work that she had pushed aside many memories of Sophia. But now, with the image of that pink headband fresh in her mind, the connection seemed impossible to ignore. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone. Deep down, she knew what she was thinking sounded crazy, even to her own ears. But Vincent's strange behavior, the decades-old family conflict, and the mysterious headband all seemed to point toward a possibility so horrifying that she could barely consider it. What if Vincent had something to do with Sophia's disappearance? The thought made her feel physically ill. It was almost too much to bear. For 10 long years, her daughter might have been so close, yet so impossibly far away. With trembling fingers, Laura dialed Daniel's number. It rang several times before he picked up, his voice filled with concern. "Laura, what's wrong? You sound worried." In a barely audible whisper, she said, "I need you to come to me right now. I'm parked on Old Miller Road, about a mile past the crossroads." "What's going on?" Daniel's tone was alarmed as he asked. "I'll explain when I get there. Please, just hurry," Laura pleaded before ending the call and sitting there, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to drive straight back to Riverside Farm to demand answers from Vincent, but she knew that would be foolish and potentially dangerous if her wild suspicions were correct. She couldn't risk tipping Vincent off. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly as she waited for Daniel, trying to calm herself and think rationally about what she had seen and heard. Yet every time she closed her eyes, she saw that pink headband lying half-buried in the dirt of Vincent Blackwood's pig barn. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes, Laura heard the familiar rumble of Daniel's old motorbike. She watched in her rearview mirror as he pulled up behind her truck and quickly dismounted. Approaching with concern etched on his weathered face, Daniel opened the passenger door and climbed in, turning to face her with worried eyes. "Laura, what's going on? Are you okay?" She looked at him, the man who had stood by her side through the darkest days of their lives, and saw the same pain and desperate hope that had sustained them for the past decade. In a trembling voice, she replied, "Daniel, I think I might have found a clue about Sophia," and with that, she began to recount the events at Riverside Farm. As her voice grew stronger with each word, Daniel's expression changed from concern to disbelief, and finally to a cautious, fragile hope. Nearly in tears, he finally said in a hushed whisper, "A pink Hello Kitty headband? And Vincent's reaction when you mention a child?" Laura nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. "I know it sounds crazy, Daniel, but you remember how Sophia always loved headbands and the way Vincent acted. There's something not right about all of this." Daniel ran a hand through his graying hair, his brow furrowed in concentration. "But Laura, the police searched all the nearby farms after Sophia disappeared. They would have found her if she were there, wouldn't they?" Frustration evident in her voice, Laura replied, "Think about it, Daniel. The farmlands are huge, with so many buildings and hidden corners. Do you really think the police had time to search every nook and cranny?" As the implications of her words sank in, Daniel's expression shifted from skepticism to a mixture of anger and determination. "You're right," he said in a low, intense voice. "Now that you mention it, I remember suspecting Vincent from the beginning. But when the police assured us he had nothing to do with it." Reaching out, Laura placed a hand on Daniel's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Getting angry now won't help us get Sophia back," she said softly. "We need to think rationally, not emotionally." After taking a deep breath, Daniel asked, "What do you think we should do? Should we call the police?" After a moment of consideration, Laura shook her head. "I don't think they'll do anything based solely on a headband and Vincent's strange behavior. Even if they decide to investigate, they need a search warrant and more evidence. So what are you suggesting?" Daniel asked with apprehension in his voice. Meeting his gaze, Laura's eyes filled with determination as she replied, I think we need to find out the truth ourselves, Daniel. We can't just sit back and do nothing. Not when there's even the slightest chance that Sophia might still be there. Daniel was silent for a long moment, weighing her words. Finally, with a voice filled with a mixture of fear and resolve, he said, Are you sure about this, Laura? What if we're wrong? What if we're just seeing what we want to see? Understanding his hesitation. After all, they had been down so many dead ends and chased so many false leads over the years. Laura softly said, I know it sounds crazy, but my gut is telling me something isn't right here. Even if there's just a tiny chance, don't we owe it to Sophia to try? Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. You're right, he said, his voice growing stronger. If there's even the slightest possibility that our little girl is out there, we have to do something. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, Laura and Daniel sat in the truck formulating a plan. They knew the risks were high, that they might be setting themselves up for another heartbreak. But the possibility of finally finding Sophia and bringing their daughter home after all these years was too powerful to ignore. As darkness fell over the Nebraska countryside, the two parents prepared to take matters into their own hands, driven by desperate hope and an unshakable love for their lost child. They made their way back to Riverside Farm. The headlights of Laura's truck cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty country road ahead. Both of them were tense, the weight of what they were about to do pressing heavily on their shoulders. Approaching the turnoff to Vincent's property, Laura killed the headlights and slowly coasted to a stop, parking the truck behind a thick cluster of trees that would hide it from view for a moment. They sat in silence, the enormity of their decision sinking in. Are you sure about this? Daniel asked one last time in a barely audible whisper. Laura nodded, her face set with determination. We have to know, Daniel. We can't walk away from this. Taking a deep breath, they exited the truck and began making their way toward the farm on foot. Under the nearly full moon, an eerie silver light cast deep, shifting shadows over the landscape as they walked. Nearing the edge of Vincent's property, Daniel suddenly grabbed Laura's arm, pulling her to a stop. Wait, he whispered urgently. I have an idea. Looking at him questioningly as he continued, he said, I'll go to the house and distract Vincent. I'll tell him I need to discuss the next hay delivery or some invoices while I keep him busy. You can search around the farm. After considering the plan for a moment, Laura nodded in agreement. It was risky, but it gave them the best chance of searching without being caught. Creeping closer to the farmhouse, they stayed low and used the shadows for cover. When they were within sight of the front porch, Daniel gave Laura's hand a quick squeeze before stepping out purposefully toward the house. Laura watched as Daniel knocked on the door. Her heart pounded in her chest. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and she could make out Vincent's silhouette in the doorway. She heard the low murmur of voices as Daniel engaged Vincent in conversation, drawing him further into the house. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Laura began to move. She made her way toward the barn where she had found the headband earlier, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement or danger. The barn door creaked slightly as she pushed it open. She winced at the sound and slipped inside, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim interior. The smell of hay and animals filled her nostrils as she moved cautiously through the space, her eyes darting around to search for anything out of place, any sign that might lead her to Sophia. In a low, almost inaudible whisper, she called out, Sophia, Sophia, are you here? Pausing to listen intently, she only heard the soft rustling of animals and the distant sound of wind outside. Moving deeper into the barn, Laura approached the area where she had found the headband earlier. She scanned the ground, hoping to find it again, but it was gone. Had Vincent removed it after her earlier visit? Just as she was about to move on, a faint, almost imagined sound caught her attention. A soft, muffled voice saying, Help! Hello, I'm here. Laura's breath caught in her throat. The voice was coming from the direction of the pig enclosures. With trembling legs and her heart pounding so loudly, she was sure it would give her away. She made her way toward the sound. As she approached one of the pig cages, the voice grew slightly louder. Climbing onto the edge of the enclosure, she peered inside, and what she saw made her entire body freeze in shock. In the corner of the cage, among the pigs, was a small figure, a little girl with one arm chained to a pole, her body covered in dirt and grime. Even through the filth, Laura could see the unmistakable red hair. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She blinked rapidly, certain she must be hallucinating, but the image before her remained unchanged. With a shaking voice, she whispered, "Sophia, is that you? Who did this to you?" The girl looked up, her eyes wide with fear, and did not answer, seeming too scared to speak. Laura's mind raced. She needed to get help to free Sophia. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Laura's words tumbled out in a rush. "Please, I need help. I found my daughter. She's been missing for 10 years. She's locked in a pig cage at Riverside Farm. Please send someone quickly." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way, but to Laura, every second felt like an eternity. She stayed by the cage, speaking softly to Sophia and assuring her that help was coming and that everything would be okay. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited, her eyes fixed on the pig cage where Sophia lay chained, each second stretching into an agonizing eternity. The silence of the barn was broken only by the soft grunting of pigs and her own ragged breathing, and she silently prayed that help would arrive before Vincent discovered her presence. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open, the sound echoing ominously in the cavernous space. Laura froze, her body rigid with fear, as Vincent appeared in the doorway, framed by the moonlight outside. The realization that a secret had been uncovered was evident in his eyes, which widened in a mixture of shock and anger. For a terrifying moment, Laura thought Vincent might lunge at her to silence her before help could arrive. Her mind raced, wondering where Daniel was, and whether Vincent had done something to him. Why hadn't he been able to distract Vincent for longer? The questions swirled in her mind, adding to her fear, but then the blessed sound of approaching sirens cut through the night air. Vincent's head snapped toward the sound, panic replacing the anger on his face, as the sirens grew louder and unmistakably drew near. Vincent turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness beyond the barn. Laura did not attempt to stop him. Her only concern now was ensuring her daughter's safety. Outside, she could hear shouting, officers commanding Vincent to surrender, their voices firm and authoritative. Moments later, a group of officers burst into the barn, weapons drawn and flashlights sweeping the area. "Police, identify yourself," they shouted. Laura raised her hands, her voice shaky as she called out, "I'm Laura Monroe. I'm the one who called you. My daughter is here." Recognizing her name, the officers quickly lowered their weapons. One officer approached the pig cage with disbelief and horror etched on his face. He attempted to open the cage, only to find Sophia still chained to a pole by one arm. "We need bolt cutters in here now," he called out to his colleagues. Another officer rushed in moments later with the necessary tool in hand. Laura watched, her heart breaking, as the officer climbed into the cage and began working on the chain. In a soft, soothing tone, the officer said, "It's okay, sweetheart. We're here to help you. You're safe now." Amidst Sophia's quiet sobs, a sound that tore at Laura's very soul, the officer eventually emerged from the cage with Sophia in his arms. The little girl looked so small and fragile, her clothes dirty and torn, her red hair matted and tangled. Though Laura longed to rush forward and embrace her, she held back, noticing that Sophia showed no sign of recognizing her. The fear and confusion in her daughter's eyes were palpable, and Laura knew it was better to give her time and ensure her safety first. As the officer carried Sophia out to the waiting ambulance, Laura followed slowly, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. Outside, the night air was filled with the flashing lights of police cars and the murmur of officers securing the scene. Amidst the chaos, Laura spotted Daniel talking to an officer. worry etched deeply on his face. Relief flooded through her at the sight of him safe and unharmed. Their eyes met, and Daniel quickly made his way over. "Laura," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm so sorry I couldn't keep Vincent distracted for long." He trailed off as his eyes widened when he saw Sophia being loaded into the ambulance. Is that her? Where did you find her?" "In the pig cage," Laura replied in a barely audible whisper. "She was chained inside." Daniel's heart ached as he realized. Our baby was chained like an animal. The reality of what they had discovered hit them anew, and Laura felt her knees buckle slightly as Daniel caught her, holding her steady. "What about Vincent?" Laura asked, suddenly remembering the man responsible for their decade of heartache. Daniel pointed to a nearby police vehicle. Through its window, they could see Vincent sitting in the back, his hands cuffed behind him. A wave of relief washed over them, knowing that he had been caught and would face justice for his crimes. An officer approached the couple, his face somber, and said gently, "Mr. and Mrs. Monroe, we're taking your daughter to the hospital for a thorough checkup and to ensure her safety. Would you like to follow in one of our vehicles? We can escort you there." Nodding, too overwhelmed to speak, they were led to a waiting police car. Laura took one last look at the barn where their daughter had been held captive for so long. Though the nightmare was not entirely over, at least now they had found Sophia. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family. The police car carrying Laura and Daniel followed closely behind the ambulance, its lights cutting through the darkness of the Nebraskan night. Inside, the couple sat in silence, hands clasped tightly together, each lost in their own thoughts about the unbelievable turn of events. Daniel was the first to break the silence, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you we'd find her, Laura," he said softly, squeezing her hand. Though he trailed off, unable to put into words the horror of their discovery and what Sophia must have endured all these years. "It breaks my heart to think about it," Laura nodded, her thoughts a whirlwind of joy at having found Sophia alive and anguish at the suffering she must have endured. "We have her back now," she whispered more to herself than to Daniel. "That's what matters. We'll help her through this, whatever it takes." The rest of the drive passed in contemplative silence, both parents lost in their own thoughts and worries about what lay ahead. The flashing lights of the ambulance in front of them served as a constant reminder of the fragile state their daughter was in. Upon arrival at the hospital, they watched as Sophia was quickly whisked away on a gurney, surrounded by medical staff. An officer gently placed a hand on Laura's shoulder as she began to follow. "I know you want to be with her," he said kindly, "but it's best to let the doctors examine her first. This must all be very confusing and frightening for her. Give her a little time." Reluctantly, Laura and Daniel agreed. They were led to a private room within the hospital, a space typically reserved for police interviews or team discussions, where two officers accompanied them, explaining that they would like to take statements while the memories were still fresh. "We understand this is a difficult time," one of the officers said, "but the more information we can gather now, the stronger our case against Vincent will be." As Laura and Daniel settled into chairs, the door opened again, and a familiar face entered the room. The detective who had been assigned to Sophia's case all those years ago. The police had clearly called him in due to his extensive knowledge of the case. "Mr. and Mrs. Monroe," the detective said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and regret. "I can't tell you how glad I am that we found her. I just wish we could have found her sooner." Laura began recounting the events that led to this moment, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. She told them about finding the headband in Vincent's barn, the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, and Vincent's suspicious behavior when she mentioned a child. She detailed their family's history of conflict with the Blackwoods, information she had shared with the police years ago, but which now took on new significance. The officers diligently noted every detail, occasionally asking for clarification or additional information. When Laura finished her account, she looked at the detective, confusion and anger warring in her eyes, and said, "I just don't understand. How could Vincent do such a horrible thing? What could possibly drive a person to steal a child and keep her locked up for 10 years? Daniel leaned forward, his face a mask of disbelief and anguish. We knew about the family conflict, the tension between us and the Blackwoods. There were land disputes, arguments at town meetings, cold shoulders at the county fair. But this, he shook his head, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of Vincent's actions. I never, in my wildest nightmares, imagined it could lead to something like this. How could anyone twist a petty feud into justification for stealing a child? Laura reached out and squeezed Daniel's hand, her eyes filling with tears. All those times we saw Vincent in town or the market, he knew where our little girl was, and he just went on with his life like nothing was wrong. The detective nodded solemnly, understanding the parents' struggle to reconcile their past experiences with the horrific reality they now faced. Sometimes people justify the most terrible actions to themselves, especially when there's a history of conflict, he said gently. But I want you both to know, no land dispute, no family feud could ever justify what Vincent did. This is on him, not on you. Daniel nodded, his jaw clenching as he fought to control his emotions. I just wish we had known. If we had any idea that our disagreements could lead to this, we would have done anything to make peace, to protect Sophia. The detective exchanged a glance with his colleagues before speaking. Vincent has been surprisingly cooperative since his arrest. He explained that he's already confessed to much of what happened. I think he knew it was over the moment we found Sophia. An officer then revealed Vincent's account of events, his words sending chills down Laura and Daniel's spines. On the day Sophia disappeared, while she had wandered onto his property lost and seeking help instead of returning to her parents, Vincent had seen an opportunity for revenge over old land disputes between their families. He initially planned to keep her for just a few days. However, days turned into weeks, and eventually, he decided he would never let her go. He even considered taking her life at one point. Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in horror, while Daniel's face hardened and his jaw clenched as he listened to the officer's words. Vincent confessed that over the years he had done terrible things to Sophia, the detective said clearly, struggling with the information himself. I won't go into details now, he added, but we'll need to discuss it eventually to build our case. When the officer offered them a break, seeing the distress on their faces, Laura and Daniel declined. They were determined to hear the full truth, no matter how painful. The officer explained that for the past few months, Sophia had been kept in the pig barn as punishment for what Vincent termed disobedience. He said she wasn't listening to him anymore, so he decided to teach her a lesson. The detective's voice was filled with disgust as he recounted, "Why didn't you find her when you searched the properties after she disappeared? Surely, you must have looked in that barn." With a heavy sigh, the detective explained, "We did search the properties, including Vincent's farm, but he must have hidden her somewhere else during that time. And you have to understand, the farmland out there is vast. There's so many buildings, so many possible hiding places. It's not an excuse, but it helps explain why we missed her." Finally, Daniel asked the question that had been burning in both their minds. Will he face justice for this? Do you have enough evidence to make sure that monster never sees the light of day again? The detective's face hardened with determination as he replied, "With Vincent's confession and the overwhelming evidence we've gathered, I can assure you he'll most likely spend the rest of his life in prison. We'll make sure of it." As the interview wound down, Laura and Daniel sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything they had learned. The nightmare of the past 10 years suddenly felt both distant and incredibly immediate. They had found their daughter, but the road ahead was far from easy. While they absorbed the horrifying details of their daughter's ordeal, the door to the interview room opened softly, and a nurse entered, her face a mixture of professional calm and genuine empathy. "Mr. and Mrs. Monroe," she said gently, "I have an update on your daughter Sophia. She's doing better now. The doctor has stabilized her condition." Leaning forward eagerly for any news, Laura and Daniel listened as the nurse continued in a soft but clear voice. "We found parasites and other infections in her body, likely due to the conditions she was living in. But I want to assure you, she will recover with proper treatment. Can we see her?" With trembling voices, a blend of fear and hope, the nurse looked to the officers, who nodded in agreement, and then said, "Yes, you can see her now." But please remember, the nurse cautioned, this is all very overwhelming for her, so take it slow. Following the nurse through the sterile hospital corridors, their hearts pounding with anticipation, they finally entered Sophia's room. They were struck by the sight of their daughter lying in a hospital bed, small, yet now noticeably cleaner, with her red hair washed and combed. The slight improvement in her appearance brought them a measure of relief. Carefully, they approached the bed, mindful of the nurse's warning. "Sophia," Laura said softly, her voice filled with love and concern. "We're your parents. Do you remember us?" Sophia looked at them with wide, uncertain eyes and, after a moment, shook her head slightly. In a barely audible whisper, she said, "I don't remember my parents." The words hit Laura and Daniel like a physical blow, but they forced themselves to remain calm. "That's okay, sweetheart," Daniel said gently. "We'll figure this out together." Fighting back tears, Laura tried a different approach. "Sophia, do you remember anything from when you were little, before Vincent's farm? We used to have a German Shepherd dog when you were about 2. Do you remember him?" Sophia's brow furrowed in concentration. After a long moment, she hesitantly replied, "I think I remember a dog, but it's not clear, just little bits of memory." Although this small recollection was vague, it filled Laura and Daniel with hope. Yet their joy was short-lived when Sophia's next words shattered their hearts all over again. In a small, frightened voice, she asked, "What did I do wrong?" Then, with a quivering tone, she continued, "Why was I locked up?" Vincent's cruel lies echoed as she whispered, "I deserved it. It was my family's fault." A surge of fury welled within Laura. She took a deep breath to calm herself before speaking. "Oh, Sophia," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing at all. Vincent is a very sick person who hurt you terribly, but you didn't deserve any of it. None of this was your fault." Daniel nodded in agreement, adding softly, "You're safe now. You'll never have to live in fear again. We're here for you, and we'll do whatever it takes to help you." As they spoke reassuringly to Sophia and offered gentle explanations, a social worker entered the room. She introduced herself and explained that she was there to help them navigate the complex situation they found themselves in. "This is a very delicate case," she explained. "Our primary goal is to ensure Sophia feels safe and comfortable. The fact that she has some memories from her past is a good sign. It will make it easier for you to bond again and for her to understand that you are indeed her real parents." The social worker then outlined their immediate plans. "For now, we think it's best if Sophia stays in a temporary social house, a safe, neutral environment where she can begin to adjust. We also have options for parents to stay there with her, so you can spend time together in a controlled, supportive setting." Laura and Daniel listened intently, nodding in understanding as the social worker's voice took on a note of cautious optimism. "Based on what I've seen so far, I believe there's a good chance that Sophia will come to accept you as her parents again with time and patience. I think she'll be able to live with you permanently." Those words filled Laura and Daniel with a hope they had not dared to feel in years, although they also knew the road ahead would be long and challenging. "What matters most right now," Laura said as she looked at her daughter's fragile form in the hospital bed, "is that Sophia feels safe and that we do whatever it takes to help her, whatever she needs." Daniel nodded in agreement. "We've waited 10 years to find her." His voice was rough with emotion as he added, "We can be patient now. We'll take it one day at a time." As they sat with Sophia, holding her hands and offering gentle words of comfort, Laura and Daniel were acutely aware of the journey that lay ahead. There would be legal battles to face as Vincent's case moved through the justice system, and there would be difficult times as Sophia struggled to overcome her trauma and adjust to her new reality. But for the first time in a decade, they could see a future filled with hope. They had found their daughter against all odds, and they were determined to help her heal and thrive. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the hospital room window, Laura and Daniel silently renewed their commitment to their daughter and to each other. The story was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a reunited family, with love, patience, and unwavering support, helping Sophia reclaim the life that had been stolen from her, one day at a time.